Hello my friends, Hank here, and today we are at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, standing in front of their beautifully restored Bf-109 G10, because today we're going to be talking all about Luftwaffe camouflage schemes, specifically those employed by the day fighter units of the German Air Force during the Second World War. In this video, I'm going to try and give a nice overview of these standard camo schemes and paint colors that we see utilized by the Luftwaffe from the pre-war period all the way up through the final days of the war in 1945. So whether you're just a curious military aviation history enthusiast, or maybe you're a scale modeler trying to make sure you've got the exact right paint colors picked out for your next Bf-109 or FW-190 project, then you, my friend, are in the right place. So with that said, let's head back to the studio for a minute here and we'll set the scene.
Alright, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of our colors themselves and the timeline in which they are employed, we first need to understand the color system that we're dealing with here. Starting way back in 1925, the German Ministry of Economic Affairs sets up the Reichsausschuss Lieferbedingungen, which I know you knew already. Okay, just kidding. That translates roughly to the Reich Committee for Delivery Conditions and is now often referred to by the acronym RAL. The RAL releases a formal color standardization guideline in 1927 for all material produced for use in any government operation. This is everything from train cars to office paint. It's very, very German, if you ask me. Now, in 1933, the German government founds the Reich Luftfahrtministerium, or Reich Aviation Ministry, to oversee all things aviation within the scope of the government and military. The new RLM decides at some point within the 1930s to break away from the otherwise standardized RAL color system and come up with their own RLM color standardization system to be used for aircraft and other aviation materiel. Why? We're not really sure. But by the time the Luftwaffe pops up in 1935, they're using RLM colors for their fighter and bomber fleets. In a departure from the RAL system, which uses 4-digit identifier codes for color recognition, the RLM system is going to use simple 2-digit codes. Our very first fighter camo that we're going to see is super simple. Pre-war fighters, starting in 1935, were painted with an all-over coat of RLM-02, which for our purposes we're going to call green slate. Nothing flashy here at all, just a basic all-over color, not even a camouflage, really. Now, some aircraft would have bits of unpainted bare metal exposed as well. After all, we're not engaged in combat, so no need to hide, right? Now, I want to point out a couple of things real quick here before we start to dive into the start of our proper camouflages. First off, today, I'm trying to help make the progression of Luftwaffe camouflage colors as understandable as possible. So the schemes we're going to be referencing are the standardized schemes used by the day fighter forces, for the most part. It goes without saying, there are exceptions to every rule. So, before you come at me in the comments with, what about JG so-and-so, they used this, I am aware. We're going to stick to our basics here. Beyond that, for my scale modeling friends, if you would like to pick up any of these paints, my go-to is Ammo by MiG. I will leave links to every single color we talk about today down in the description below if you'd like to grab them for yourself. All right, PSA complete. Let's carry on. By 1937, 1938, we start to see our first proper fighter camouflages pop up as the German Condor Legion becomes involved on the side of the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. Our first belly colors for the bottom of the aircraft, intended to serve as sky camouflage, blending in with the sky as viewed from below, is RLM 65 Hellblau, or light blue. Beyond that, we start to see a very simple two-tone splinter camouflage being used on the upper surfaces of our day fighters. This would be comprised of RLM 70 Schwarzgrün, or black green, and RLM 71 Dunkelgrün, or dark green. The spines and upper surfaces of the wings of the fighters would be painted with hard-edged geometric splinters of RLM 70 and 71. And the flanks of the aircraft would either be mostly RLM 65 Hellblau or this two-tone scheme, depending on how far down the camo was painted on the sides of the aircraft. Our earlier fighters tended to have the darker camouflage extending further down on the sides of the aircraft, but as the early campaigns in Poland and France and the Low Countries proved, this tended to make the aircraft more visible to enemy units in the air. That dark RLM 70-71 stuck out like a sore thumb in a clear blue sky. So as these early campaigns progressed, you start to see the Hellblau belly color really creeping up more and more, with many fighters just having the upper surfaces of the wings and the very top of the spine painted in the darker camo. Another variation on the RLM 65-70-71 scheme replaced either the RLM 70 or 71 with our original RLM 02 green slate, which resulted in a slightly less saturated, lighter overall scheme. At this point in time, worth noting, these basic splinter schemes are pretty much entirely factory applied paint. Once these aircraft start reaching units in the field, we start to see the more complex and unique camo schemes developing that have really become synonymous with the Luftwaffe fighters of the Second World War. The ground crews would work with pilots to add specialized camo to these aircraft, usually varying degrees of modeling, striping, speckles, you name it, all using the available and approved RLM colors on hand. So, if you're looking to recreate an early war 1939, 40, 41 scheme on a scale model project you're working on, so pretty much any iteration of the BF-109E or early A models of the FW-190, as long as you stick with RLM 65, 70, 71, and RLM 02, you're going to be in good shape. I like to refer to this period of Luftwaffe camouflage as the Green Era. Now, our big exception here with the Green Era in regard to day fighters comes with Operation Sonnenblume in February of 1941. Italian forces in North Africa have largely been routed by the British, and the German Afrika Corps is sent in to try and clean up the mess and secure Germany's southern flank. Luftwaffe units operating in Africa and the Mediterranean begin receiving fighters painted in a basic two-tone desert camouflage consisting of RLM 79 Sandgelb, or sandy yellow, and RLM 78 Sky Blue. Our RLM 79, as the name might suggest, is a warm, mustardy yellow color designed to blend in with the sand and rock of North Africa, while our RLM 78 Sky Blue is a more saturated, warmer blue than the RLM 65 applied to the bellies of aircraft fighting in the European theater. Super simple here. Upper surfaces of our aircraft, RLM 79. Bottom surfaces, RLM 78. In addition to this basic scheme, we also start to see ground crews in Africa start to apply RLM 80 olive green, or olive green, in splotches and models on the upper surfaces of the aircraft to help blend in with the low-lying vegetation found in this part of the world. This cheetah print style camouflage has become rather famous and popular with modelers recreating North African theater aircraft over the years. So, to recap, our pre-war fighters, all over RLM 02. Early campaigns, France, Poland, Low Countries, Battle of Britain, RLM 65 on the bellies and flanks, RLM 70-71 splinter camo on the upper surfaces, sometimes with some RLM 02 mixed in there as well. Tropical fighters, RLM 78 on bottom, RLM 79 on top, sometimes add some RLM 80. Good? You following along okay? I know it's a lot, but I'm trying to keep it at least relatively concise here. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, what about those fighters I see with yellow or white wingtips, tails, noses? Now, that is a very fair point. Starting around the time of the Battle of Britain, we do see special color blocking being used for purposes of quick, friendly identification while these fighters are in the air. This usually consisted of RLM 04 or RLM 27 yellow, covering some combination of the engine cowl covers, either the top, the bottom, or both, as well as the rudder and undersides of the wingtips. Now, all of this is so that friendly fighters and ground forces could see a German fighter with these markings and immediately identify it as not a threat. Some units used white or even red in rare cases to achieve the same effect, though these are far less common than the yellow option. As the war progressed, color blocking and striping started to be used to distinguish aircraft belonging to different units and different theaters, as well as squadron or group leaders, though for the purposes of today's particular video, we're not going to dive into that right now. If you are interested in learning about the tactical markings employed by the Luftwaffe during World War II, though, you can check out my video on the subject right here. So, at this point, we've reached the end of 1941, and this is where we start to enter what I like to call the gray era of Luftwaffe fighters. Starting at the tail end of 1941 and throughout the next 2 years, many Luftwaffe day fighters started coming out of the factory with a new two-tone geometric splinter camo scheme. In November of 1941, new orders go out that all new fighters leaving the factories are to be painted with RLM 76 Weißblau, or white blue, on the bellies and flanks, and RLM 74 Dunkelgrau, or dark gray, and RLM 75 Grau Violet, or gray violet, on their upper surfaces. This is going to be the color palette we see for Luftwaffe day fighters throughout the middle part of the war, and to some extent through to the very final days of the conflict. The RLM 74, 75, 76 scheme was deemed to be more effective camouflage for units fighting both in the east and the west, and as such becomes standardized through the day fighter units. As we saw earlier with our RLM 65, 70, 71 scheme, though, we of course see lots of additional camouflage being added by units in the field. And now, since these crews have access to substantial amounts of RLM 02, 70, 71, 74, 75, you often see modeling and other camouflage patterning applied in the field using any combination of these colors on top of the factory applied RLM 74, 75, 76. So, any units fighting in the Soviet Union, Greece, Sicily, Italy, in defense interceptor units over Western Europe itself from 1942 through to the end of 1943 are almost definitely going to be painted up in this RLM 74, 75, 76, the gray scheme. Down in North Africa, however, we're still using the same RLM 78, 79, 80 tropical scheme that we saw back in 1941, and that's going to continue until the final days of the North African campaign in the spring of 1943.
All right, we are back at the American Heritage Museum to take a closer look at this gorgeous Bf-109 G10. Now, this particular aircraft was captured at the end of the war in Austria. It's unclear whether she originally belonged to a Luftwaffe unit or a Hungarian Air Force unit, as both were operating in the area at the time, but either way, she ends up in the hands of the Bulgarian Air Force for a time after the war. Shortly after that, she's sold to the Yugoslav Air Force, where she serves until finally being retired in the 1950s. Eventually, she makes her way over here to the States and undergoes extensive restorations in the 90s, and it is at this time that she's repainted to what you see here today. This current paint job depicts Ace of Aces, Eric Hartmann's final Bf-109 during his time leading the first group of JG-52 in the spring of 1945. Now, this 109 is a great example of the RLM 74, 75, 76 gray camo scheme that came about during the middle of the conflict and persisted to some extent up through the end of the war. So here we see the belly of the aircraft. Up to about 2/3 of the fuselage is in RLM 76 Weissblau, or white blue. And then our spine is a lovely mixture of RLM 74 and 75 in the standard splinter scheme. The lighter of our two colors is our RLM 75 Grau Violet. You can see it does have a very subtle violet shade to it here. And this darker color is our RLM 74 Dunkelgrau Dark Gray. If we head over to the wings, we can see that this RLM 74-75 splinter pattern is continued. We start at the wing root, and then we've got a softer edge splintering of RLM 74 on a bed of RLM 75. Beyond our basic splintering, we do have some subtle modeling of RLM 74 breaking up our Weissblau on the fuselage here and spreading all the way back towards the tail. And up front, of course, we have the iconic black tulip motif made famous by Eric Hartmann, but that is by no means standard issue, quite the opposite. Now, let's head back to the studio and check out our next camo scheme that starts to come to the forefront in the very final years of World War II.
So, once we reach 1944, things start to get a little squirrely for the German armaments industry. Germany itself is getting routinely smashed by massive Allied bombing raids, and it's not as easy as it once was to keep up with any form of standardization. Beyond that, acquisition of raw materials is becoming an issue, and priority is being placed on material deemed absolutely essential to the war effort. Part of the decision to phase out RLM 65 in favor of RLM 76 as the main sky camouflage for day fighters, for example, is believed to be because the paint required a significant amount of cobalt in its production. Cobalt is needed for the production of high-grade industrial tool steels, which of course takes priority over paint. Around this time, we start to see the introduction of a final late war splinter camo scheme that I like to call the brown era of Luftwaffe fighters. This final scheme is made up of RLM 76 Weissblau, which carries over from the previous scheme for our aircraft's underbellies, as well as a two-tone splinter camo for the top consisting of RLM 81 Braun Violet, or brown violet, and RLM 82 Hellgrün, or light green. The biggest influence on this change to the final brown scheme was, beyond the desperate supply situation in Germany, the fact that air superiority over the continent had long been lost by the Luftwaffe. By the middle of 1944, more German aircraft are being destroyed by Allied bombers and fighter bombers on the ground than in the air for the very first time since the war started, so it is critically important for this new camouflage scheme to help provide effective cover for aircraft on the ground, hidden throughout the German countryside. And once again, as we'd seen with all of our previous phases of camouflage, ground crews are also going to be using existing approved camouflage paint colors in stock to apply additional camouflage to their aircraft. And on top of that, some aircraft are still coming out of the factories in our mid-war gray scheme while supplies last, as we saw with the Hartmann 109 that we checked out over at the American Heritage Museum. The late war brown scheme is most synonymous with some of the final fighter variants taken to the skies over Europe in the waning months of the Second World War. Think FW-190D Doras and late A model versions, Bf-109 G10s, 14s, K4s, as well as the groundbreaking Me-262 jet and Me-163 rocket interceptors. By the very, very end of the war, we even have some aircraft taken to the skies with small amounts of RLM 76, 81, 82 quickly being applied over the machine's bare metal finish. Some of the Me-262s captured by the Allies at the end of the war were very clearly rushed out of the factory at the last possible second and only have basic national insignia slapped on there. So, in the spring of 1945, the Second World War comes to an end for the Germans, and so too does the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium. Throughout the war, we see three major camouflage palettes utilized by the infamous and deadly day fighters of the Luftwaffe. From 1939 through to the end of 1941, the green era of German fighters is in full swing. RLM-65 bellies and fuselages topped with splintered and modeled RLM-70 and 71 on the wings and spine of the aircraft. From the tail end of 1941 through to the start of 1944, the day fighters are in their gray era. Bellies and fuselages of RLM-76 topped with splintered and modeled RLM-74 and 75 on the wings and spine. This gray scheme will continue with some aircraft through to the very end of the war, though it begins to be eclipsed by the brown era starting in 1944. Our RLM-76 remains for the lower portions of the aircraft, but our upper camouflage colors now consist of RLM-81 and 82. Tropical aircraft serving in the Mediterranean and North African theater from 1941 through to the spring of 1943 are adorned with RLM-78 bellies and RLM-79 upper surfaces, plus a little RLM-80 for that extra effect. And of course, though we didn't explicitly mention it earlier in the video, fighters operating in winter conditions were often whitewashed with an all-over white paint to blend in with the snow.
So there you have it, my friends, a crash course on the camouflage schemes of Luftwaffe day fighters. If you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to subscribe right here to Spruce and Bruce Scale Modeling for more helpful tips, tutorials, and history chats like this one. And if you're ever in the greater Boston area, you've got to swing by the American Heritage Museum and check it out. One of the finest collections of military vehicles anywhere in the world. With that said, my friends, I'm gonna go look around a little bit. I love this place. Be well, happy building, cheers.